In the rugged mountains of Arizona, Aiyana, a 30-year-old Apache tracker with a muscular build and weathered hands from years of survival, lives a solitary life haunted by the loss of his younger sister 5 years ago. When a massive, otherworldly dog appears during a violent storm and drags him into a forbidden canyon that his tribe has avoided for generations, Aiyana discovers something that will shatter everything he believes about life, death and the bonds that transcend both worlds. The lightning split the Arizona sky like a jagged scar, illuminating the face of Aiyana Blackfeather as he pressed his back against the cold limestone cliff. At 30 years old, his copper-toned skin bore the marks of countless seasons spent tracking game through these unforgiving mountains. His black hair, usually braided with leather strips, now hung loose and dripping from the torrential rain that had caught him miles from home. Thunder crashed overhead, so close it seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. Aiyana's dark eyes scanned the treacherous terrain below, searching for shelter. His muscular frame, built from years of hunting and survival, trembled, not from cold, but from something else entirely. Something that made his Apache instinct scream danger. "Damn storm came out of nowhere," he muttered, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. He pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his chest, feeling the familiar weight of his grandfather's turquoise pendant against his skin, the only thing he had left of his family. The rain came down in sheets now, turning the rocky path into a treacherous river of mud and stone. Aiyana knew these mountains better than any man alive, had tracked deer and elk through every hidden trail since he was old enough to hold a bow. But tonight, something felt different. Wrong. A low growl rumbled through the storm, so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. Aiyana froze. In all his years in these mountains, he'd never heard anything like it. Bears, mountain lions, even the occasional wolf, he knew their calls like his own heartbeat. This was something else entirely. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of massive paws splashing through the flooded canyon below. Aiyana pressed himself harder against the cliff face, his hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife at his belt. His grandfather had taught him that when the spirits grew restless, wise men listened, but wisdom and curiosity had always warred in Aiyana's heart. Through the driving rain, a shadow moved in the canyon, impossibly large, moving with a fluid grace that defied its size. Lightning flashed again, and for one terrifying moment, Aiyana saw it clearly, a dog unlike anything that had ever walked this earth. It stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with fur as black as the storm clouds above, and eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The creature's massive head turned upward, fixing its gaze directly on Aiyana's hiding spot. Those glowing eyes met his, and something electric passed between them, not fear but recognition, as if they had been searching for each other across lifetimes. "Impossible," Aiyana whispered, but even as the word left his lips, he knew he was looking at something beyond the realm of possibility. The giant dog began to climb. Its claws found purchase on the slick rock face, as easily as if it were walking on level ground. Water streamed from its massive form as it ascended, muscles rippling beneath its midnight fur. Aiyana had seen many predators in his life, but this creature moved with purpose. Not the random hunger of a wild animal, but the focused intent of something with a mission. Every instinct told him to run, but where could he go? The storm had turned the mountain paths into death traps, and behind him lay only the sheer cliff face that dropped into Whispering Canyon, the place his grandfather had warned him never to enter. "The spirits of the lost dwell there," the old man's voice echoed in his memory. "They call to the living, but those who answer never return unchanged." The dog reached his ledge in seconds that felt like hours. Up close it was even more magnificent and terrifying. Its shoulders were broader than a man's, its head massive and noble like some ancient wolf king. But it was the eyes that held Aiyana captive, ancient, knowing, filled with a sadness that seemed to echo his own. For a moment they simply stared at each other. The storm raged around them, But in that bubble of eye contact, the world grew still. Aiyana felt something stir in his chest, a recognition he couldn't name, a pull he couldn't resist. Then the creature did something that shattered Aiyana's understanding of reality. It spoke, not with words, but directly into his mind. Its voice like distant thunder. "She is waiting." The words hit Aiyana like a physical blow. His knees buckled, and he would have fallen if not for the cliff face at his back. "Who?" he gasped aloud. "Who is waiting?" But the giant dog had already moved. Before Aiyana could react, massive jaws closed gently around his jacket and lifted him from the ledge. He found himself dangling from the creature's mouth like a pup being carried by its mother. But there was nothing maternal about their destination. The dog leaped. For a heart-stopping moment, they were airborne in the storm, suspended between the lightning-torn sky and the black mouth of Whispering Canyon below. Aiyana's stomach lurched as gravity claimed them, and they plummeted into the forbidden depths that his people had avoided for generations. The walls of the canyon rushed past in a blur of ancient stone and shadow. Aiyana caught glimpses of cave openings and ledges carved with symbols he didn't recognize, pictographs that seemed to move in the lightning's strobe. The air grew warmer as they descended, filled with a strange, sweet scent that reminded him of desert flowers after rain. They landed with surprising gentleness on a sandy floor far below. The giant dog released him carefully, and Aiyana stumbled forward on unsteady legs, his mind reeling from what had just happened. Above them, the storm seemed muted, its fury dampened by the canyon walls, but it was what lay ahead that stopped his breath entirely. The canyon opened into a vast underground chamber, lit by an impossible soft blue glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Crystals of every color imaginable jutted from the ceiling and floor, creating a cathedral of natural beauty that no human eyes should have witnessed. And there in the center of it all stood a figure that made Aiyana's heart stop. A young Apache woman with long black hair and wearing a white buckskin dress sat beside a crystal-clear pool, her back to him. She was humming a lullaby, the same lullaby his sister Kaya used to sing when she thought no one was listening. "No," Aiyana whispered, his voice breaking. "It can't be." The figure turned, and Aiyana saw a face he had mourned for 5 long years, the face that haunted his dreams and drove him to these lonely mountains, where he could grieve in solitude. "Hello, big brother," said Kaya, her voice exactly as he remembered it, warm, gentle, filled with the love that had been the brightest light in his world. The giant dog settled beside the pool and transformed before Aiyana's eyes, shrinking and shifting until it became a normal-sized border collie, with gentle brown eyes, the same dog that had died trying to save Kaya from the flash flood that had taken her life. "Spirit," Aiyana breathed, recognizing his sister's beloved companion. Everything Aiyana thought he knew about life and death crumbled in that moment. His sister was here, whole and beautiful, in a place that shouldn't exist. The dog that had died with her sat at her side, tail wagging softly as if they had simply been apart for an afternoon instead of 5 years. Tears streamed down Aiyana's face as he took a tentative step forward, afraid that movement might shatter this impossible vision. His hands shook as he reached toward the sister he had failed to save, the sister whose death had driven him into these mountains to live like a ghost among the living. "Kaya," his voice was barely a whisper. "Is it really you?" She smiled, that radiant smile that had lit up their childhood, and opened her arms. "I've been waiting for you to find me, Aiyana. We both have." Aiyana's legs gave out beneath him as he collapsed to his knees on the crystal-studded sand. The impossible sight before him, his sister Kaya, alive and radiant in this otherworldly cavern, shattered every belief he had clung to since her death. His muscular frame, which had carried him through countless hunts and survived the harshest mountain winters, now trembled like a child's. "This isn't real," he gasped, pressing his palms against his eyes. "The storm, I hit my head when I fell. This is just a dream, a hallucination. But when he opened his eyes, Kaya was still there, still smiling that gentle smile that had been his anchor through their difficult childhood. She rose gracefully from beside the crystal pool, and Aiyana noticed she cast no reflection in the water's surface. The realization sent ice through his veins. "You're not dreaming, big brother," Kaya said softly, taking a step toward him. Her voice carried the same musical quality he remembered, but there was something else now, an otherworldly resonance that seemed to come from the very stones around them. "And you're not hallucinate." Spirit, the border collie who had transformed from that massive creature, padded over to Aiyana and gently nuzzled his hand. The dog's fur was warm and real beneath his fingers, but like Kaya, there was something fundamentally different about him, a luminescence that seemed to emanate from within. "Then what are you?" Aiyana whispered, his voice cracking with 5 years of suppressed grief. "Kaya, I watched you die. I held your broken body after the flood waters receded. I buried you with our grandmother's prayer beads." Kaya knelt beside him, and though Aiyana could see her clearly, feel the warmth radiating from her presence, she didn't disturb the sand beneath her knees. "I am exactly who I've always been, Aiyana, your little sister who sang you to sleep when the nightmares came. The one who followed you on hunting trips, even when you told me to stay home. The one who believed in magic when you thought you were too old for such things. But you're dead," he said, the words ripping from his throat like broken glass. "Death is not what we were taught it was," she replied, reaching out as if to touch his face. Her hand stopped, just short of his skin, hovering there like a whisper of warmth. "This place sits between worlds. A realm where souls who have unfinished business can wait for those they love." Aiyana looked around the impossible cavern with new eyes. The blue glow that illuminated everything seemed to pulse with a heartbeat, and he realized the crystals weren't just reflecting light, they were generating it, each one containing what looked like trapped starlight. The walls were covered in symbols that shifted and changed as he watched, telling stories in a language older than words. "Unfinished business," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Kaya's expression grew sad, and for the first time since he'd entered this place, she looked exactly as young as she had been when she died. Barely 22, still believing the world was full of wonders waiting to be discovered. "You blamed yourself for my death," she said simply. "For 5 years you've carried that guilt like a stone around your heart. You've punished yourself by living alone in these mountains, cutting yourself off from everyone who cared about you. Uncle Thomas, Cousin Maria, even old Joe Crow Feather, who taught you to track, they've all tried to reach you, but you won't let anyone close." The truth of her words hit Aiyana like physical blows. After Kaya's death, he had indeed retreated from the reservation, from the community that had raised him, from any connection that might remind him of what he'd lost. He'd told himself it was grief, but deep down, he knew it was guilt. "I should have been faster," he said, the confession pouring out of him like blood from a wound. "When the flash flood came down the canyon, I should have reached you in time. If I hadn't been showing off, trying to climb that rock formation to impress you." "Stop." Kaya's voice carried a authority he'd never heard from her in life. "That flood moved faster than any human could have anticipated. The weather service said it was a once-in-a-century event. You dove into that torrent and nearly drowned trying to save me. Spirit and I, we were swept away so quickly that even if you had been standing right next to us, it wouldn't have mattered." Spirit whined softly and pressed closer to Aiyana, and suddenly he was flooded with flashes of memory. Not his own memories, but the dog's. He saw the flood from Spirit's perspective, the wall of water appearing around a bend with no warning. Kaya's scream of terror, the desperate attempt to reach higher ground that came just seconds too late. He felt the dog's fierce determination to protect his beloved human, and then the crushing weight of water that took them both. "He stayed with me," Kaya continued, stroking Spirit's ethereal fur. "Even in death, he wouldn't leave me. That's how we ended up here, in this between place. Love that's strong creates its own kind of magic." "But why?" Aiyana asked, struggling to understand. "Why show me this now? Why not 5 years ago when I needed?" Because 5 years ago you wouldn't have been ready to see, interrupted a new voice. Aiyana spun around to find an elderly Apache man emerging from behind one of the larger crystal formations. He was tall and dignified, wearing traditional clothing that seemed to be made of the same starlight as the crystals themselves. His long white hair was braided with feathers that moved in a breeze. Aiyana couldn't feel, and his eyes held the wisdom of countless generations. "Grandfather?" Aiyana breathed, recognizing the man who had raised him and Kaya after their parents died in a car accident. "Hello, grandson," said Henry Blackfeather, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "It took you long enough to find your way here. But you're not dead," Aiyana protested. Even as the words left his mouth, he remembered the phone call from Uncle Thomas 3 months ago, the one he'd ignored like all the others. The voicemail he'd deleted without listening to. His grandfather's expression grew gentle but sad. "My body gave out this past winter, Aiyana. My heart, the doctors said. But I chose to wait here rather than move on, because I knew you would need guidance when you finally found this place." The crushing weight of another loss, one he'd been too wrapped up in his own pain to acknowledge, drove Aiyana to his feet. He staggered backward, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd missed, what he'd lost while hiding in his self-imposed exile. "No, no, no," he moaned, his voice echoing off the crystal walls. "Not you too, grandfather. I can't. I should have been there. I should have come back to the reservation, should have taken care of you." "And what then?" his grandfather asked, his tone firm but kind. "You would have watched me die while drowning in guilt over Kaya. You would have blamed yourself for my death too. Aiyana, my boy, you cannot save everyone. The spirits decide when it is time, not us. But I've lost everyone," Aiyana said, his voice breaking completely. "Everyone I've ever loved is gone, because I couldn't protect them." Kaya moved closer, and this time when she reached out, her hand almost seemed to touch his face. He felt the ghost of her fingers against his cheek, warm and comforting like she used to do when he had nightmares as a child. "That's not true, brother," she whispered. "You haven't lost us. We're right here. We've always been here, waiting for you to understand that love doesn't end with death, it just changes form. The living world still needs you," his grandfather added, stepping forward. "There are people on the reservation who remember the boy who used to track wounded animals just to heal them. The young man who would give his last piece of bread to hungry children. Uncle Thomas named his new son after you. Did you know that? Little Aiyana Crow Dog, born just last month." The news hit him like a physical blow. While he'd been wallowing in isolation, life had continued. People had been born, had grown up, had needed him, and he'd been too lost in his own pain to be there for any of it. "I don't know how to go back," he admitted, sinking down onto a smooth boulder. "I don't know how to live in a world without you both in it. But we are in it," Kaya said, settling beside him in that way she had as a child, when she'd comfort him after their parents died. "Every sunset that reminds you of the evenings we spent watching the sky from Eagle's Peak, every time you hear a meadowlark sing and remember how I used to imitate their calls, every act of kindness you show to someone who needs help, we're there." Spirit walked over and placed his head on Aiyana's lap, looking up at him with those wise, ancient eyes. In that gaze, Aiyana saw not just the loyal companion who had died protecting his sister, but something larger, the spirit of unconditional love that transcends physical form. "The question," his grandfather said, settling on Aiyana's other side, "is what will you do with this knowledge? Will you return to the living world and honor our memory by embracing life again? Or will you stay here with us and abandon the people who still need you?" Aiyana looked around the magical cavern, at the two people he'd loved most in the world, at the loyal dog who had never stopped protecting them. The temptation to stay was overwhelming. Here, there was no pain, no loss, no responsibility. Here, his family was whole again. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew what the answer had to be. The crystals around them began to pulse brighter, responding to his internal struggle. In their faceted surfaces, he began to see images. Uncle Thomas holding a baby with Aiyana's name, tears streaming down his face as he spoke to the empty air, asking his absent nephew to come home. Cousin Maria standing at his grandfather's grave, looking toward the mountains where she knew Aiyana was hiding. Old Joe Crow Feather, now too frail to hunt alone, sitting by his fire and telling stories to anyone who would listen about the greatest tracker he'd ever known. "They need me," Aiyana whispered, the truth settling into his heart like a seed taking root. "Yes," Kaya said simply. "They do, but how do I leave you again?" The question tore from him like a sob. "How do I walk away when I just found you?" His grandfather placed a hand on his shoulder, and for a moment Aiyana felt the solid warmth of that familiar touch. "You don't walk away, grandson. You carry us with you. Every lesson I taught you, every song Kaya sang, every moment of love we shared, it all goes with you back to the world of the living." "The choice is yours, brother," Kaya said, her voice growing fainter as the crystals began to dim. "But choose quickly. This place exists outside of time, but your body is still on the mountain in the storm. If you stay too long, you won't be able to return." Aiyana felt it then, a pull from somewhere above, the sensation of his physical form lying unconscious in the rain. He realized that everything that had happened, while absolutely real, existed on a plane beyond the physical world. His body was dying of exposure while his spirit learned the most important lesson of his life. "Will I see you again?" he asked desperately, as the magical realm began to fade around the edges. "Every day," Kaya promised, her smile radiant even as she became translucent. "In every sunrise, every kind word, every life you touch, we are always with you, Aiyana. You just have to remember to look." Spirit gave one final, echoing bark that seemed to say goodbye and thank you, and I love you all at once. His grandfather's last words followed him as consciousness slipped away. "Live, grandson. Live fully, love deeply, and honor our memory by becoming the man we always knew you could be." The crystal cavern dissolved around him like mist, taking with it the most beautiful and heartbreaking reunion he would ever experience. But the love that stayed with him, burning Aiyana's eyes snapped open to a world of pain and bitter cold. Rain hammered his face like tiny needles, and his body lay twisted against the rocky canyon floor where the giant spirit had deposited him. Every muscle screamed in agony, and his clothes were soaked through to the bone. But he was alive, impossibly, miraculously alive. He struggled to sit up, his head spinning from what felt like the worst hangover of his life. The storm still raged overhead, though it seemed less violent now, as if the fury that had driven it was finally beginning to exhaust itself. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the canyon walls that rose around him like ancient sentinels. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind. Had it all been a hallucination brought on by hypothermia and head trauma? Had his desperate grief finally driven him completely over the edge, into madness? Then he felt it, a warmth in his chest that hadn't been there for 5 years. Not the burning ache of loss and guilt he'd carried like a stone around his heart, but something else entirely, something that felt suspiciously like peace. "Kaya," he whispered into the storm, and the name didn't tear at him the way it usually did. Instead, it felt like a prayer, like a blessing, like the first word of a song he was finally ready to sing again. He pushed himself to his feet on unsteady legs, looking around the canyon floor where he'd landed. There was no sign of the magical crystal cavern, no glowing entrance to a realm between worlds, just wet stone and scattered boulders, ordinary and mundane in the lightning's harsh illumination. But when he looked closer at the rock face, he could swear he saw symbols carved into the stone, ancient pictographs that seemed to shift and dance when he wasn't looking directly at them. A sound made him turn, and his heart nearly stopped. Sitting calmly in the rain as if waiting for him was a border collie, not the massive, otherworldly creature that had dragged him into the canyon, but a normal-sized dog with gentle brown eyes and fur matted by the storm. The dog's tail wagged once, slow and deliberate, and Aiyana knew with absolute certainty who he was looking at. "Spirit," he breathed, and the dog's ears perked up in recognition. The collie stood and began walking toward what appeared to be a narrow path leading up the canyon wall, a path that definitely hadn't been there before. He paused and looked back at Aiyana, as if to say, "Well, are you coming?" Aiyana followed, his legs shaky but growing stronger with each step. The path was treacherous, made more so by the rain, but somehow his feet found purchase on ledges that should have been too slick to navigate. It was as if the mountain itself was helping him, guiding him safely upward. As they climbed, the storm began to break. The rain gentled to a drizzle, then stopped altogether. The clouds parted like curtains, revealing a sky full of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. And there, hanging low on the horizon, was the most beautiful dawn Aiyana had ever seen. The sight stopped him in his tracks. When was the last time he'd really looked at a sunrise? When was the last time he'd allowed himself to find beauty in the world instead of just surviving in it? Every sunrise, Kaya's voice whispered in his memory, "We are always with you, Aiyana. You just have to remember to look." Spirit barked once, soft and encouraging, then continued up the path. They emerged onto a plateau just as the sun crested the mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson that made Aiyana's breath catch in his throat. In the distance he could see the lights of the reservation home calling to him across the miles like a beacon. But first, he had a journey to make. The walk back to his cabin took most of the morning. Spirit trotted alongside him the entire way, sometimes visible, sometimes seeming to fade like morning mist, but always there when Aiyana needed the reassurance of his presence. They didn't speak, not in words anyway, but there was a communication between them that went deeper than language. By the time they reached the small, weathered structure Aiyana had called home for the past 5 years, the sun was high overhead and birds were singing in the pine trees. The cabin looked exactly as he'd left it, sparse, functional, more like a survival shelter than a home. No photographs on the walls, no personal touches that might remind him of better times, just the bare necessities of existence. He stood in the doorway, looking at this monument to his own self-imposed exile, and felt a wave of disgust wash over him. This wasn't living, this was just a slow form of dying. "Well, Spirit," he said to the dog, who had settled on the porch as if he'd always belonged there, "I guess it's time to make some changes." The first thing he did was shower and change into clean clothes. Then he sat at the small wooden table that served as his desk and pulled out a piece of paper, the first letter he'd written in 5 years. "Uncle Thomas," he began, his handwriting rusty from disuse. "I know I've been away too long. I know I've missed too much, and I'm sorry. I heard about grandfather, and I should have been there. I should have been there for a lot of things. But I'm ready to come home now if you'll have me. I'm ready to meet my namesake and to help where I'm needed. I have some healing to do, not just for myself, but for the damage my absence has caused. I'll be there by tomorrow evening. There's something I need to do first. Your nephew, Aiyana." He sealed the letter and walked to where his old motorcycle was parked, under a lean-to behind the cabin. The bike hadn't been started in months, but after a few tries, it roared to life. Spirit looked at him questioningly. "Don't worry," Aiyana told him with a smile that felt rusty but real. "We're not going far, just paying a visit to an old friend." The ride to Joe Crowfeather's place took 20 minutes on winding mountain roads. The old tracker lived in a traditional hogan on a piece of land his family had held since before the reservation was officially established. Aiyana parked the bike and walked to the door, Spirit padding silently beside him. Joe emerged before Aiyana could knock, as if he'd been expecting this visit for years. The Lloyd man was smaller than Aiyana remembered, more frail, but his dark eyes were still sharp as obsidian. "Aiyana Blackfeather," Joe said simply. "About damn time." "Hello, Uncle Joe." The traditional greeting felt strange on Aiyana's tongue after so many years of silence. "I've come to ask for your help. Have you now?" Joe's weathered face creased into a knowing smile. "And what kind of help would that be?" "I need to learn how to live again," Aiyana said, the words coming from a place of profound honesty. "I need to remember who I was before the grief took over. And I need to figure out how to help people instead of just hiding from them." Joe studied him for a long moment, and Aiyana had the unsettling feeling that the old man could see right through to his soul. Finally, Joe nodded. "The fact that you're here, asking that question, tells me you've already started learning," he said. "Come, we have much to discuss, and apparently you have a story to tell me about that storm last night." They spent the afternoon talking. Aiyana found himself telling Joe everything about the giant dog, about the crystal cavern, about seeing Kaya and his grandfather in that realm between worlds. He expected skepticism, maybe even concern for his sanity. Instead, Joe listened with the grave attention of someone who understood that the world was far stranger and more wonderful than most people ever realized. "Our ancestors knew about such places," Joe said, when Aiyana finished. "Thin spots, where the veil between worlds grows gossamer fine. Your grandfather wrote to me about that canyon before he passed. Said he'd been having dreams about it, about you finding your way there when you were ready." "He knew?" Aiyana asked, stunned. "Henry Blackfeather was a wise man who understood that some journeys can't be rushed," Joe replied. "He also understood that the dead don't rest easy when those they love are destroying themselves with guilt." They talked until the sun began to set, Joe sharing stories about Aiyana's grandfather, about the community he'd been absent from, about the changes and challenges the reservation faced. But he also shared memories of the young Aiyana, the boy who had tracked a wounded eagle for 3 days just to nurse it back to health, who had given his birthday money to a family whose house had burned down, who had the rare gift of seeing the sacred in the ordinary. "That boy is still in there," Joe said, as they watched the first stars appear. "He's just been sleeping under all that pain. Time to wake him up." As if summoned by the old man's words, spirit materialized beside Aiyana's chair, solid and warm and real. Joe's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't seem particularly surprised. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "That's Kaya's dog, isn't it? The one that died with her. His name is Spirit," Aiyana confirmed, stroking the collie's fur. "He's helping me find my way." "Spirits often do when we're wise enough to listen," Joe said. "The question is, what are you going to do with this second chance you've been given?" Aiyana was quiet for a long moment. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. Each point of light reminded him of the crystals in that otherworldly cavern, and he could almost hear Kaya's voice on the wind, encouraging him to be brave. "I'm going home," he said finally. "I'm going to meet my namesake nephew. I'm going to help Uncle Thomas with whatever he needs. I'm going to make amends for the years I lost to grief." And then, Aiyana smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Then I'm going to live. Really live. The way Kaya and grandfather would want me to. I'm going to track more than just animals. I'm going to track ways to help people, ways to honor the gifts I've been given." Joe nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather would be proud. Your sister too." "They know," Aiyana said with quiet certainty. "Somehow they know." He spent the night in Joe's guest room, the first real bed he'd slept in for months. Spirit curled up on the floor beside him, a comforting presence that chased away the nightmares that had plagued his sleep for 5 years. Instead, he dreamed of sunrise over the reservation, of children's laughter, of his hands healing instead of just surviving. He dreamed of coming home. The next morning, Joe packed him a bag of traditional foods, fry bread, jerky and honey cakes that his wife had made before she passed. "For the journey," he said simply, "and for sharing when you get there. Food always makes apologies go down easier." Aiyana secured the bag to his motorcycle and prepared to leave for the reservation. Spirit sat beside the bike, tail wagging, clearly ready for whatever came next. "Will you visit?" Joe asked, as Aiyana climbed onto the bike. "Every week," Aiyana promised. "I've got 5 years of visits to make up for, and I suspect you've got about a lifetime's worth of stories I need to hear." "That I do, boy, that I do." As Aiyana kick-started the motorcycle, Joe called out one last thing. "Remember the spirits that guided you to that canyon? They're not done with you yet. This is just the beginning." Aiyana nodded, understanding flowing through him like warm honey. The giant dog that had dragged him into the depths wasn't just spirit in another form. It was the manifestation of love that transcends death, the force that connects all living things, the magic that happens when we finally choose to embrace life instead of merely enduring it. He gunned the engine and pulled onto the road that would take him home, spirit running alongside the bike like a living embodiment of joy. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and promise, and for the first time in 5 years, Aiyana Blackfeather was no longer running from his life. He was running toward it. The familiar red dust of the reservation road kicked up behind Aiyana's motorcycle as he approached the cluster of houses that had once been his world. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird, and his hands trembled on the handlebars. 5 years was a long time to be gone. 5 years was long enough for people to stop expecting you to come back. Spirit ran alongside the bike, his form flickering between solid and translucent in the afternoon heat. Sometimes he looked like the faithful border collie Kaya had loved so much, and sometimes he seemed to shimmer with that otherworldly presence from the canyon. But his eyes, those warm, intelligent eyes, remained constant, offering silent encouragement with every stride. The first house Aiyana passed belonged to Mrs. Elena Yazi, who had taught him and Kaya traditional weaving when they were children. She was hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 cottonwood trees, her grey hair braided with red ribbon, the way she'd adored it for as long as he could remember. She looked up at the sound of his motorcycle and froze, a wet sheet clutched in her weathered hands. Their eyes met across the dusty yard, and Aiyana saw recognition dawn in her face, followed quickly by something that might have been relief. She dropped the sheet back into the basket and raised one hand in greeting, tentative but warm. Aiyana lifted his hand in return, and the simple gesture felt like the first step across a bridge he'd thought was burned beyond repair. He didn't stop at Mrs. Yazi's house, though every instinct screamed at him to delay the inevitable confrontation with his family. Instead, he continued down the main road toward the house where he'd grown up, where Uncle Thomas now lived with his wife Maria and their children. The house looked smaller than he remembered, but well maintained. Someone had painted the trim a cheerful blue, and there were flower boxes under the windows that definitely hadn't been there when he was a boy. A swing set occupied one corner of the yard, and toys were scattered across the porch in the chaotic way that spoke of children who were loved and allowed to play freely. Aiyana parked his bike at the end of the gravel driveway and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. Through the screen door, he could hear the sounds of family life, voices talking over each other, the clatter of dishes, a baby's gurgling laugh that made his chest tight with unnamed emotion. Spirit materialized beside the bike, solid as life, and nudged Aiyana's leg with his nose. The message was clear: "You've come this far. Don't stop now." "Right," Aiyana murmured, dismounting and walking toward the porch steps. Time to face the music. He was halfway up the steps when the screen door burst open, and a small projectile launched itself at his leg. Aiyana stumbled backward, looking down to find a little girl of maybe 4 years old, clinging to his knees, her dark eyes wide with curiosity. "Mama," she hollered toward the house. "There's a strange man on our porch. Lily, get away from there," came a woman's voice from inside, followed by rapid footsteps. Maria Crow Dog appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression shifting from maternal concern to shock in the space of a heartbeat. She was a few years older than Aiyana, with laugh lines around her eyes and gray threading through her long black hair, but she was still the same girl who had helped patch him up after playground fights when they were children. "Aiyana," she whispered, as if saying his name too loudly might make him disappear like smoke. "Hello, cousin," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. I got your messages. All of them. I'm sorry I never." He never got to finish the sentence. Maria handed the dish towel to little Lily and crossed the porch in 3 quick strides, wrapping Aiyana in a hug so fierce it nearly knocked him off his feet. She was smaller than him by a foot, but her embrace felt strong enough to hold the pieces of his broken world together. "You stupid, stubborn man," she said into his shoulder, her voice thick with tears. "Do you have any idea how worried we've been? How many times Thomas drove up into those mountains looking for you?" "I know," Aiyana said, returning her hug with interest. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry, Maria." She pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face the way she'd done when they were teenagers, and she was trying to talk sense into him about some foolish plan. "You look terrible," she said, but she was smiling through her tears. "Too thin. And when's the last time you cut this hair?" Before Aiyana could answer, another voice called from inside the house. "Maria, who's out there? And why is Lily saying something about a strange man?" Thomas Crow Dog appeared in the doorway, and Aiyana's breath caught in his throat. His uncle had aged in the 5 years he'd been gone. There was more grey in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, a slight stoop to his shoulders that spoke of carrying heavy burdens. But when he saw Aiyana, those familiar dark eyes lit up with an emotion so intense it was almost painful to witness. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Thomas breathed, using the odd mixture of Christian and traditional expressions that had always made Kaya giggle. "Aiyana, is that really you, boy?" "It's me, Uncle," Aiyana said, stepping forward. "I'm home." Thomas moved faster than a man his age should have been able to, crossing the porch and pulling Aiyana into a bear hug that smelled like sage and coffee and home. 5 years, he said fiercely. 5 goddamn years, and not so much as a phone call to let us know you were alive. "I know," Aiyana said again, the words feeling inadequate, but necessary. I was lost, Uncle. But I'm here now. I'm here, and I want to make things right." "Papa, who is this man?" Lily piped up from where she stood, clutching Maria's dish towel, clearly fascinated by all the adult emotions swirling around her. Thomas pulled back from the hug and scooped up his daughter, settling her on his hip. "Lilybug, this is your cousin Aiyana, the one we named your baby brother after." Lily studied Aiyana with the intense curiosity of a 4-year-old. "You don't look like a baby," she observed matter-of-factly. Despite everything, Aiyana found himself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in 5 years. "No, I guess I don't, but your baby brother and I have the same name." "That's silly," Lily declared. "How do people know which one you're talking about?" "Well, I'm the big Aiyana, and he's the little Aiyana," he explained solemnly. "Can I meet him?" Lily nodded enthusiastically and wriggled out of her father's arms. "I'll go get him. He's taking a nap, but he won't mind if I wake him up." "No, Lily," Maria started, but the little girl was already racing into the house. "She's got a lot of energy," Aiyana observed, watching her go. "Takes after her mother," Thomas said dryly, earning himself a gentle swat from Maria. "Come on inside, nephew. We've got a lot to catch up on," and Maria was just starting dinner. "I hope you remember how good her green chill stew is." The interior of the house was warm and lived in, filled with the comfortable clutter of a family that had put down deep roots. Photographs covered every available surface: Thomas and Maria's wedding, Lily's first steps, school pictures and holiday gatherings, and candid moments of joy. Aiyana found himself staring at a picture of his grandfather from what must have been his last birthday, surrounded by family members who had come to celebrate with him. Family members who had included everyone except the grandson who was hiding in the mountains, too wrapped up in his own pain to be present for the people who loved him. "He asked for you every day at the end," Thomas said quietly, following Aiyana's gaze. "Right up until the morning he didn't wake up. 'Has my boy come home yet?' That's what he'd ask first thing every morning." The words hit Aiyana like physical blows, each one a fresh reminder of how much his self-imposed exile had cost. Not just him, but everyone who cared about him. "I should have been there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, you should have," Thomas agreed, and his bluntness was somehow more healing than false comfort would have been. "But you're here now, and that's what matters. The dead don't hold grudges, Aiyana. They want the living to find peace and move forward." Before Aiyana could respond, Lily came racing back into the room, her arms full of squirming baby. "Here he is," she announced proudly. "This is little Aiyana." Maria hurried forward to take the baby from her daughter's enthusiastic grip. But Aiyana found himself stepping closer, drawn by a force he couldn't name. The baby was maybe 6 months old, with the round cheeks and bright eyes that made all infants look like tiny miracles. His hair was jet black and stuck up in every direction, and when he saw Aiyana, he stopped fussing and stared with the intense focus that babies reserved for faces they found particularly interesting. "Can I hold him?" Aiyana asked, surprised by how much he wanted to. Maria smiled and carefully transferred the baby to his arms. Little Aiyana settled against his namesake's chest with a contented sigh, one tiny fist grabbing onto Aiyana's shirt as if claiming ownership. The sensation of holding new life, warm and trusting and perfect, broke something open in Aiyana's chest. He'd been so focused on death and loss and guilt that he'd forgotten how miraculous birth could be, how much hope could be contained in such a small package. "He likes you," Lily observed with satisfaction. "He doesn't like everybody," he cried when Mrs. Henderson tried to hold him last week. "That's because Mrs. Henderson smells like mothballs," Thomas said with a grin. "This little guy's got good instinct." As if in agreement, baby Aiyana made a happy gurgling sound and tried to grab his older namesake's nose. The simple gesture of infant trust and affection undid the last of the walls Aiyana had built around his heart. Tears streamed down his face as he held this child who carried his name, who represented everything he'd missed while drowning in his own sorrow. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, not sure if he was apologizing to the baby, to his family, or to the universe in general. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here." "Shh," Maria said gently, putting her arms around both Aiyana and the baby. "You're here now. That's what counts." Thomas joined the impromptu group hug, and even Lily wrapped her small arms around everyone's legs, creating a circle of warmth and acceptance that Aiyana had forgotten was possible. They spent the evening catching up on 5 years of news. Thomas told him about the changes on the reservation, new programs for at-risk youth, efforts to preserve traditional languages, the ongoing challenges with funding and resources. Maria shared stories about the children, about her work as a teacher, about the community members who had moved away or passed on. They talked about lighter things too. Lily's obsession with horses, little Aiyana's first attempts at solid food, the gossip and everyday dramas that made up the fabric of reservation life. It was the kind of comfortable, meandering conversation that families have when they're truly at ease with each other, and Aiyana found himself remembering why he'd loved this life so much before grief had driven him away. As the evening wore on, he told them about his experience in the canyon, about seeing Kaya and his grandfather in that realm between worlds. He expected skepticism, but Thomas and Maria listened with the grave attention Joe Crow Feather had shown. "The old ones always said the spirits watch over us," Thomas said, when Aiyana finished. "I'm glad they finally managed to get through that thick skull of yours." "Uncle Thomas," Maria scolded, but she was smiling. "What?" "The boy needed a good talking to from beyond the grave. Sometimes that's what it takes." Later, as they were cleaning up from dinner, Thomas pulled Aiyana aside. "There's something you should know," he said quietly, "about why we were so desperate to reach you." Aiyana felt his stomach drop. "What is it?" "There's a development company from Phoenix that's been sniffing around, trying to buy up reservation land for a resort. They've already got a few people considering selling, including some of the families who are struggling nationally. We've been fighting it through legal channels, but you need someone who knows every inch of these mountains," Aiyana finished, understanding immediately. Someone who can document the sacred sites and the wildlife patterns that would be destroyed. Thomas nodded. Your grandfather left detailed notes, but he always said you were the one who really knew the land. Said you could track a shadow across bare rock and tell stories about every tree in the forest. He exaggerated, Aiyana said, but he felt a stirring of purpose that he hadn't experienced in years. But yes, I can help with that. I want to help. The hearing is next month, Thomas continued. If we can present a strong case for the ecological and cultural significance of the land, we might be able to stop them. But we need someone who can speak with authority about what would be lost. Aiyana looked around the warm, comfortable house, at the family photos and children's artwork on the walls, at Lily coloring quietly at the kitchen table while little Aiyana slept peacefully in his carrier. This was what the developers would destroy. Not just trees and rocks, but a way of life, a community, a connection to the land that went back thousands of years. I'll do whatever you need, he said firmly. This is my home too, and it's worth fighting for. Thomas clasped his shoulder, and Aiyana could see the relief in his uncle's eyes. Welcome home, nephew. We've missed having you in our corner. As the night deepened, Maria made up the couch for Aiyana to sleep on. Just for tonight, she insisted. Tomorrow we'll figure out something more permanent. Unless you're planning to go back to that cabin in the mountains. Aiyana thought about the sparse, cheerless shelter he'd called home for 5 years, then looked around at this house full of warmth and laughter and love. No, he said decisively. I think it's time I remembered what it means to live in a community instead of just surviving alone. That night, as he lay on the couch listening to the soft sounds of a sleeping household, Aiyana felt Spirit settle beside him on the floor. The dog was barely visible in the darkness, more presence than substance, but his warmth was real and comforting. Thank you, Aiyana whispered to the spirit guide who had dragged him back from the edge of despair. For everything. Spirit's tail thumped once against the floor, and Aiyana could swear he heard an echo of Kaya's laughter in the sound. She was proud of him, he realized. Proud that he'd finally chosen to come home, to rejoin the world of the living, to use his gifts in service of something larger than his own pain. For the first time in 5 years, Aiyana Blackfeather fell asleep without nightmares, surrounded by love and with hope burning bright in his chest like a sacred fire. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he was exactly where he belonged. 3 weeks later, Aiyana stood at the edge of Eagle's Peak, the highest point on the reservation, watching the sunrise paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. In his hands he held a thick folder containing photographs, maps and detailed documentation of every sacred site, wildlife corridor, and ecologically significant area that would be destroyed if the Phoenix developers got their way. Spirit materialized beside him, solid in the morning light, his fur rippling in the mountain breeze. Over the past weeks, the border collie had become a constant companion, appearing whenever Aiyana needed guidance or comfort, fading when solitude was required. The other members of the community had accepted the dog's presence without question. After all, stranger things had happened on the reservation, and Spirit's gentle nature made him beloved by everyone, especially the children. Today's the day, Aiyana murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. The hearing that decides whether this place stays protected or gets turned into another golf course for rich tourists. Spirit whined softly and pressed against Aiyana's leg, offering silent support. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled over the canyon, where Aiyana had first encountered the giant dog version of his companion. The synchronicity wasn't lost on him. Everything had led to this moment, this chance to protect the land that had both sheltered and healed him. The sound of an approaching vehicle made him turn. Thomas's pickup truck wound its way up the narrow mountain road, dust billowing behind it. As it drew closer, Aiyana could see that the truck bed was full of people from the community: elders, young parents, teenagers who should have been in school but had chosen to stand up for their heritage instead. Ready for battle, Thomas called out as he parked the truck. As ready as I'll ever be, Aiyana replied, tucking the folder under his arm. The next hour was a whirlwind of preparation. Maria had organized a caravan of vehicles to transport community members to the county courthouse in Flagstaff. Joe Crowfeather, despite his age and frailty, insisted on coming along as a witness to the traditional uses of the land. Even Mrs. Elena Yazzie had closed her weaving shop for the day to attend the hearing. But it was the sight of little Lily Crow Dog, dressed in her best traditional outfit and carrying a hand-drawn sign that read, "Save Our Mountains," that nearly brought tears to Aiyana's eyes. She'd insisted on coming despite Maria's protests, declaring that her baby brother's future was at stake too. "The land belongs to the children," the 4-year-old had announced with the solemn authority that only small children could muster. "And I'm a child." As they made the drive to Flagstaff, Aiyana reviewed his presentation one last time. He'd spent weeks documenting everything: the migration patterns of elk and deer, the nesting sites of endangered birds, the locations of ancient pictographs and burial grounds. But more than that, he'd captured the stories the land held, the connections between place and people that couldn't be quantified in dollars and cents. The courthouse was an imposing brick building that spoke of power and bureaucracy. As they approached the steps, Aiyana saw that they weren't the only ones who had come to fight. Representatives from the development company were already there, men in expensive suits carrying briefcases full of economic projections and environmental impact statements designed to minimize their project's harm. Leading the group was a silver-haired man in his 50s who radiated the kind of confident arrogance that came from never having lost a battle that mattered. He was speaking with a woman in a power suit, gesturing dismissively toward the growing crowd of tribal members. "That's Richard Hawthorne," Thomas said quietly, "CEO of Desert Mirage Development. He's the one who's been trying to buy up the land." Aiyana studied the man who threatened everything he'd come to value again. Hawthorne looked like every corporate villain from every movie, too well-groomed, too confident, too comfortable with the idea that money could solve any problem or overcome any objection. "He doesn't look like much," Aiyana observed. "Don't underestimate him," Thomas warned. "He's got lawyers, lobbyists and politicians in his pocket. This isn't going to be easy." Inside the courthouse, the hearing room was packed to capacity. The tribal delegation filled one side, while Hawthorne's people occupied the other. At the front of the room, a panel of 3 judges, 2 men and a woman, sat behind a massive wooden bench, reviewing documents with the studied indifference of people who made these kinds of decisions every day. The lead judge, a stern-faced man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, called the hearing to order. "We're here today to consider the application by Desert Mirage Development to purchase and develop approximately 2,000 acres of land currently held in trust by the Apache Nation. Hawthorne, you may present your case first." Hawthorne rose with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. His presentation was polished and professional, slideshows depicting luxury resorts, economic impact studies promising hundreds of jobs, architectural renderings that made the proposed development look like a harmonious blend of modernity and nature. "Your Honors," he concluded, "this project represents a golden opportunity to bring prosperity to a region that has struggled economically for decades. We're not talking about destroying the environment. We're talking about working with it, creating a sustainable tourism destination that will benefit everyone." The judges nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by the slick presentation. Aiyana felt his stomach tighten as he realized how outmatched they were. Hawthorne had resources, professional expertise, and the kind of presentation that boards of directors and government officials found irresistible. "Mr. Crowdog," the lead judge said, turning to Thomas, "you may present your response." Thomas stood, and Aiyana could see the slight tremor in his hands as he approached the podium. His uncle was a good man, a respected leader in their community, but he wasn't used to fighting battles in courtrooms filled with hostile strangers. "Your Honors," Thomas began, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. What Mr. Hawthorne is proposing isn't development, it's desecration. The land he wants to buy contains sacred sites that have been significant to our people for over 1,000 years. It's home to wildlife that depends on these specific corridors for migration and breeding. It's not just real estate, it's the heart of who we are as a people. He spoke for 20 minutes passionately but without the polish and visual aids that had made Hawthorne's presentation so compelling. Aiyana could see the judge's attention wandering, their expressions growing skeptical. They'd heard similar arguments before, and without concrete evidence to back up the emotional appeals, the words carried little weight. "Thank you, Mr. Crowdog," the lead judge said when Thomas finished. "Do you have any additional witnesses or evidence to present?" Thomas looked back at Aiyana, who rose from his seat with the thick folder in his hands. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Aiyana Blackfeather, our community's chief tracker and land specialist." As Aiyana walked to the front of the courtroom, he felt the weight of every eye upon him. The tribal members watched with hope and anxiety, while Hawthorne's people regarded him with the dismissive curiosity reserved for minor obstacles. But it was the judge's expressions that concerned him most, polite but skeptical, already mentally moving on to their next case. "Mr. Blackfeather," the lead judge said, consulting his notes, "I understand you've prepared some documentation regarding the ecological significance of the disputed land." "Yes, Your Honor," Aiyana replied, opening his folder. "But if I may, I'd like to start by telling you a story." Hawthorne's lead attorney started to object, but the judge waved him off. "Proceed, Mr. Blackfeather, but please be concise." Aiyana took a deep breath and began. "3 weeks ago, I was a man lost in grief, living alone in the mountains because I'd forgotten what it meant to be part of something larger than my own pain. I'd convinced myself that I was too broken to be of use to anyone, that the world was better off without my involvement." He pulled out the first photograph, a stunning image of the canyon at sunrise, with eagles soaring overhead and ancient pictographs visible on the cliff faces. "Then something happened that reminded me that we're all connected. The land, the animals, the people, the spirits of those who came before us. This canyon, this specific piece of earth that Mr. Hawthorne wants to turn into a resort, is where I learned that lesson." He spread more photographs across the evidence table, detailed close-ups of rare plants, images of wildlife that most people would never see, pictures of petroglyphs that told stories older than written history. "These aren't just pretty pictures for a nature calendar," Aiyana continued, his voice growing stronger. "This is documentation of an ecosystem so complex and interconnected that disturbing any part of it would collapse the whole. These migration routes have been used by elk and deer for thousands of years. These nesting sites are home to 3 species of raptors that are protected under federal law. These pictographs represent the recorded history of my people, a library written in stone that can never be replaced." He pulled out a detailed topographical map marked with different colored pins. Every red pin represents a burial ground. Every blue pin marks a site where our ancestors held ceremonies that connected them to the spiritual essence of this land. Every green pin shows a spring or water source that provides life to both wildlife and the vegetation they depend on. The judges leaned forward, suddenly paying closer attention. The lead judge picked up one of the photographs, a close-up of ancient handprints painted on a cave wall. "Mr. Blackfeather," he said slowly, "how old are these pictographs?" "Carbon dating suggests anywhere from 800 to 1200 years old." "Your Honor, but our oral traditions place ceremonial use of these caves much earlier, possibly 2,000 years or more." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Hawthorne's confident expression was starting to crack around the edges. Aiyana pressed his advantage. "But there's something else, Your Honor. Something that Mr. Hawthorne's environmental impact study failed to mention." He pulled out a series of photographs showing a small, unremarkable-looking plant growing in rocky crevices. "This is Penstemon clutii, the sunset crater beard tongue. It's found in only 3 locations in the entire world, and one of those locations is in the heart of the land Hawthorne wants to develop. It's not just rare, it's currently under consideration for federal endangered species protection. The female judge picked up the photograph, studying it intently. Are you saying this plant exists nowhere else? I'm saying that if you destroy its habitat here, you're potentially eliminating 30% of its remaining global population. Aiyana replied, but more than that, this plant is part of a delicate web of relationships with other species, specific pollinators, soil microorganisms, even the elk that disperse its seeds through their seasonal migrations. He spread out more documentation, detailed ecological surveys, botanical studies, wildlife population data that painted a picture of an environment so precisely balanced that any major disturbance would have cascading effects throughout the entire system. Mr. Hawthorne talks about working with nature, Aiyana continued, but you can't work with something you don't understand. His development would fragment wildlife corridors that have existed since the last ice age. It would alter drainage patterns that feed the springs our people have depended on for generations. It would bring thousands of tourists into an area that currently supports a carefully balanced ecosystem. He paused, looking directly at each of the judges. Your Honors, I spent 5 years in these mountains learning to read the stories written in stone and soil and the movement of animals across the seasons. What I learned is that some things are more valuable than money. Some places are too sacred to be bought and sold. The courtroom was completely silent. Even Hawthorne seemed to realize that his polished presentation had just been dismantled by a man with a folder full of photographs and an intimate knowledge of the land he was fighting to protect. But Aiyana wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something that made several people in the courtroom gasp. A perfect arrowhead made from obsidian so pure it seemed to glow with inner light. I found this yesterday, he said quietly, in a cave system that would be directly underneath Mr. Hawthorne's proposed main lodge, along with pottery fragments, grinding stones and other artifacts that suggest continuous habitation for at least 1,500 years. Under federal law, this discovery requires a complete archaeological survey before any development can proceed. Hawthorne's attorney was on his feet immediately. Objection. This evidence wasn't submitted in advance, and we haven't had a chance to verify its authenticity or significance. Your Honor, Aiyana said calmly, I only made this discovery yesterday, and I came straight here this morning. I'm willing to submit to any authentication process the court requires, and I'm prepared to guide a certified archaeological team to the site immediately. The lead judge studied the arrowhead, then looked at Hawthorne, whose face had gone pale. Miss Hawthorne, were you aware of the potential for significant archaeological finds in the proposed development area? Our initial survey suggested minimal cultural significance, Hawthorne stammered, clearly thrown off his game. An initial survey that apparently missed burial grounds, ceremonial sites, and now potentially significant archaeological deposits, the female judge observed dryly. Aiyana could feel the mood in the room shifting. What had started as an uphill battle against corporate resources was becoming something else, a recognition that some places held values that couldn't be measured in economic terms. Your Honors, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for the land. I'm not asking you to stop progress or economic development. I'm asking you to recognize that true progress means understanding what we're about to lose before we lose it forever. This isn't just about my people's heritage, it's about preserving something irreplaceable for all future generations. He gathered up his photographs and documentation, but left the arrowhead on the evidence table where it caught the courtroom's fluorescent lights and seemed to pulse with ancient power. The spirits of this land have waited over 1,000 years for someone to speak for them in a place like this, Aiyana concluded. Today I'm honored to be that voice. The silence that followed was profound. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the power of what she'd just witnessed. Finally, the lead judge cleared his throat. This court will recess for 2 hours while we review all submitted evidence and consider our decision. Hawthorne, I strongly suggest you consult with your legal team about the archaeological implications of Mr. Blackfeather's findings As people began filing out of the courtroom, Aiyana felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Thomas beaming at him with pride. "That," his uncle said quietly, "was exactly what your grandfather would have done. He always said you had the gift of making people see the truth in ways they couldn't ignore." Around them, tribal members were embracing and crying with relief and hope. Even the judges had seemed moved by Aiyana's presentation, and Hawthorne's team was huddled in frantic conference, clearly scrambling to salvage their project. But it was the sight of little Lily tugging on his jacket that brought Aiyana back to what mattered most. "Did we win?" he asked with the directness that only 4-year-olds could manage. Aiyana knelt down to her level, looking into dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence and hope. "I don't know yet, little one, but we told them the truth about why this place matters, and sometimes that's enough." Lily considered this seriously, then nodded. "The mountains are happy," she announced with the certainty of someone who believed the natural world had feelings worth considering. As they waited for the judges to return, Aiyana felt Spirit brush against his leg. The dog was barely visible in the courthouse's harsh lighting, more presence than substance, but his approval was palpable. Somewhere in that realm between worlds, Kaya and his grandfather were watching, proud of the man who had finally learned to use his gifts in service of something larger than his own pain. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time in years, Aiyana Blackfeather felt like he was exactly where he belonged, standing up for the voiceless, protecting the sacred, and honoring the connections that bound all living things together. 2 hours felt like a lifetime. Aiyana paced the courthouse hallway, his weathered hands trembling slightly, as he thought about everything that hung in the balance. Around him, members of his community waited in tense silence, some praying softly, in Apache, others simply holding each other for comfort. When the bailiff finally called them back into the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Hawthorne and his team looked confident again, having spent the recess making phone calls and presumably arranging contingency plans. But there was something in the lead judge's expression that gave Aiyana hope, a gravity that suggested the weight of the decision had not been lost on him. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, the lead judge began, his voice carrying throughout the packed courtroom. "This panel has reached a unanimous decision." Aiyana felt his heart stop beating. The archaeological evidence presented by Miss Blackfeather, combined with the documented presence of endangered species and the significant cultural heritage sites, creates a compelling case for preservation under both state and federal law. The application by Desert Mirage Development is hereby denied pending a full archaeological survey and environmental impact assessment by independent federal agencies. The courtroom erupted. Tribal members jumped to their feet, embracing and crying with joy. Thomas wrapped Aiyana in a bear hug that lifted him off his feet, while Maria burst into tears of relief. Even little Lily seemed to understand the magnitude of the moment, clapping her hands and shouting, "We won! But it was what happened next that would stay with Aiyana for the rest of his life. As the celebration continued around him, he felt a familiar presence at his side. Spirit materialized more solidly than he'd appeared in weeks, his ethereal form gaining substance until he looked like any normal border collie. The dog's tail wagged furiously as he looked up at Aiyana with those wise, loving eyes, and beside Spirit, barely visible but unmistakably there, stood Kaya. She looked exactly as she had in the crystal cavern, radiant, peaceful, filled with pride and love. Her lips moved in words Aiyana couldn't hear over the celebration, but he could read them clearly. "I'm so proud of you, big brother." Behind her their grandfather appeared, his weathered face creasing into a smile that encompassed generations of wisdom and love. He raised his hand in the traditional gesture of blessing, and Aiyana felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the victory they'd just won. Other figures began to materialize around them, ancestors Aiyana had never met, but somehow recognized, spirits of the land who had waited centuries for someone to speak for them in a place of power. The courthouse filled with a presence that made the air shimmer with sacred energy, and for a moment, the veil between worlds grew thin enough for the living and the dead to share the same space. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, the spirits began to fade. But before she vanished entirely, Kaya stepped forward, and for the first time since the crystal cavern, her hand touched Aiyana's face, solid, warm, real. "Your journey is just beginning," she whispered, her voice audible now, despite the noise around them. "The land is safe, but there are others who need what you've learned. Promise me you won't go back to the mountains alone." "I promise," Aiyana said, tears streaming down his face. "I promise I'll stay connected, stay involved, stay alive in ways that matter." "Good," she said, her smile brighter than the sun. "Because little Aiyana is going to need his uncle to teach him how to track. And Lily needs someone to show her the old stories written in stone. The circle continues, brother. The circle always continues." One by one, the spirits faded, until only spirit remained. The border collie looked up at Aiyana one last time, his tail wagging with pure joy, then began to shimmer and fade like morning mist. "Thank you," Aiyana whispered to his sister's beloved companion. "For everything, for bringing me home." Spirit's bark echoed in dimensions beyond the physical world, a sound of completion and gratitude and love that transcended species and mortality. Then he too was gone, leaving only the memory of unconditional loyalty and the knowledge that some bonds truly are eternal. Aiyana knelt beside the crystal-clear spring that bubbled up from the rocks near the heart of the preserved canyon. In his arms he held little Aiyana, now walking and chattering in the way of toddlers who had discovered the world was full of wonders. The baby's chubby hands reached toward a butterfly that danced just out of his grasp, and his delighted laughter echoed off the canyon walls. "See that, little one?" Aiyana said softly, pointing to ancient pictographs on the rock face above them. "Those are the stories your ancestors left for you. Someday when you're older, I'll teach you how to read them." Behind them, the sounds of construction drifted on the wind, not the destructive machinery of development, but the careful work of building the Apache Cultural and Ecological Research Center. Federal grants and private donations had funded a project that would preserve the archaeological sites while creating jobs and educational opportunities for the community. Thomas approached, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had seen his impossible dreams come true. "The university team says they found 3 more burial sites," he reported, settling beside Aiyana on a sun-warmed boulder. "And that botanist from Arizona State thinks she's identified 2 plant species that were previously unknown to science. Grandfather always said this place held secrets," Aiyana replied, accepting the cup of coffee gratefully. "I don't think even he knew how many." They sat in comfortable silence, watching little Aiyana explore the world with the fearless curiosity of someone who had never known anything but love and safety. In the distance, Lily's voice carried on the breeze as she led a group of visiting children on a nature walk, already showing the keen observation skills that Aiyana had been teaching her. "She's going to be a tracker," Thomas observed with pride. "Maybe even better than you, if that's possible." "She already is," Aiyana said with a smile. "Yesterday she showed me a fox den I'd missed, and last week she found an owl pellet that contained the bones of a species I'd never seen before. The gift skips generations sometimes, but it's strong in her." Red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the canyon walls in a sound that had remained unchanged for thousands of years. Aiyana watched its flight pattern and remembered the massive otherworldly spirit who had first dragged him into this canyon, setting in motion the chain of events that had saved not just the land, but his own soul. "Do you ever see them?" Thomas asked quietly. "Kaya and the old man, I mean, the spirits that helped you find your way back." Aiyana considered the question, then pointed to where Lily was teaching the children to identify animal tracks in the soft sand. "Every day," he said simply. "In every act of teaching, every moment of connection, every time someone chooses to protect something precious instead of exploiting it. They're not gone, Uncle. They've just changed form." As if summoned by his words, a border collie trotted into view, following Lily's group with the patient attention of a born guardian. It was a living dog this time, one of a litter that had been born to a stray female who had appeared on the reservation shortly after the court victory. The tribal council had voted to keep all the puppies, and they'd become beloved community members, known for their uncanny ability to find lost children and comfort the grieving. This particular pup had attached himself to Aiyana's family, showing up at their door each morning and following little Aiyana everywhere. They'd named him Ghost, both for his habit of appearing and disappearing without warning, and for the way his presence seemed to bring peace to troubled hearts. Sometimes, Aiyana admitted watching Ghost interact with the children, "I swear he looks at me with eyes that remember everything, as if some part of the original spirit lives on in all of them." The old ones would say that's exactly what happens, Thomas replied. Energy doesn't die, it just finds new ways to serve love. They were interrupted by the arrival of Maria, who carried a picnic basket and wore the expression of someone who had news to share. "The federal archaeology team just called," she announced, settling beside them on the rocks. "They want to expand the protected area by another 1,000 acres. Apparently yesterday's ground-penetrating radar survey revealed what might be an entire ancient village site, 1,000 more acres safe," Aiyana said, shaking his head in wonder. "If someone had told me 2 years ago that I'd be sitting here, surrounded by family, watching my nephew play in a canyon that's now permanently protected, you'd have thought they were crazy," Thomas finished with a grin. "But that's the thing about miracles, they always seem impossible until they happen." As the afternoon wore on, more community members arrived for what had become a weekly tradition, a gathering at the sacred spring where elders shared stories, children learned about their heritage, and families reconnected with the land that sustained them all. Joe Crow Feather arrived despite his advancing years, carried in the back of a pickup truck, and settled into a comfortable chair someone had brought for him. His eyes might be dimming, but his memory was sharp as ever, and the children gathered around him like flowers turning toward the sun. "Tell us about the time Uncle Aiyana saved the mountains," Lily demanded, as she did every week. Joe's weathered face creased into a smile. "Well now, little one, that's not how the story goes at all. The mountains saved Uncle Aiyana. He was just wise enough to listen when they called." As the old man began the familiar tale, one that would be passed down through generations, growing richer with each telling, Aiyana felt little Aiyana's weight grow heavy in his arms as the toddler fell asleep to the sound of his great-uncle's voice. The baby's face was peaceful in sleep, unmarked by loss or grief, or the kind of devastating loneliness that had once consumed his namesake. He would grow up knowing he was loved, knowing he belonged to something larger than himself, knowing that the land beneath his feet held stories and spirits and connections that bound all living things together. "Uncle Aiyana," Lily appeared at his elbow, her dark eyes serious. "Will you teach me to see the spirits in the canyon?" "Like you did that night." Aiyana considered the question carefully. "The spirits show themselves when someone is ready to see them, little one. But I can teach you to listen with your heart instead of just your ears, to look with your soul instead of just your eyes. The rest is up to them." "Good," she said with satisfaction, "because sometimes I think I see a big dog running with Ghost, and I want to make sure I'm not imagining things." Aiyana's breath caught in his throat. Following his gaze, he looked to where Ghost was playing with the children, and for just a moment, just a heartbeat, he could swear he saw a larger shadow running alongside the little border collie, a presence filled with joy and protective love. "You're not imagining anything," he told Lily softly. "Some connections are stronger than death, stronger than time, stronger than the distance between worlds. When you love someone completely, part of them stays with you always." As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson that took Aiyana's breath away, the gathering slowly dispersed. Families headed home for dinner. Elders were helped to their cars, and children ran ahead with the boundless energy of those who had spent the day in perfect happiness. But Aiyana lingered, holding his sleeping nephew while Thomas and Maria packed up their things. This place had become more than just a victory or a symbol. It had become the center of a web of relationships that stretched across generations, connecting the living with the dead, the human with the natural, the individual with the community. "Ready to head home?" Maria asked gently. Home, the word still filled him with wonder. Not the isolated cabin where he'd hidden from life, but the warm, noisy, loving chaos of the house he now shared with Thomas's family. Home meant little Aiyana's midnight cries and Lily's endless questions and Ghost's gentle presence at the foot of his bed. It meant community dinners and family arguments and the sweet burden of being needed by people who loved him. "Almost," he said. "Just give me one more minute." As his family headed toward the trucks, Aiyana stood alone beside the sacred spring, holding the sleeping child who carried his name and his hopes for the future. The canyon walls rose around them like the arms of ancestors, protecting and sheltering and blessing. "Thank you," he whispered to the spirits who had guided him home, to the sister who had waited for him in a realm between worlds, to the grandfather who had known that some journeys couldn't be rushed. "Thank you for not giving up on me when I gave up on myself." The wind through the canyon carried back what might have been voices, what might have been music, what might have been the eternal song of love that connects all things across all worlds. Little Aiyana stirred in his arms, smiling in his sleep, as if he too could hear the melody. As they walked toward the truck where his family waited, Aiyana felt the presence of spirit one last time. Not the massive, otherworldly creature who had dragged him into the canyon, not the normal-sized dog who had guided him home, but something even more powerful, the essence of unconditional love that transcends form and substance and time. The circle was complete. The broken man who had hidden in the mountains had become the healer who protected sacred ground. The uncle who had failed to save one child now held another, carrying forward the names and stories and connections that made them all part of something eternal. Behind them, the canyon held its ancient secrets close, while ahead, the lights of the reservation beckoned them home to a community that had never stopped believing in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that love could triumph over loss. And in the growing darkness, a border collie that was more than a border collie ran alongside their truck, his joyful bark echoing across dimensions, reminding anyone who had ears to hear that some bonds truly are unbreakable and some love truly is forever.